Hey guys, it's Pastor Dave and we are here on Transfiguration Sunday. You're going to find out what that means in a second. Let's get right to the gospel. The gospel of the day, Luke chapter 9. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions, but Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. So here we are on Transfiguration Sunday, the day when Jesus revealed himself to his disciples on a mountaintop. They finally saw who he was, dazzling white, transcending earth and heaven, shining out for them to see. It was what they had always dreamed of. They were sure he was God. But the part that we want to talk about is less what he looked like and more Peter's response to this event. Because Peter, like any of us would have been, was overwhelmed when he saw Jesus, heard a voice come from the cloud saying, "This is my son, the beloved," etc., etc. He was terrified, he panicked, and like most of us do, he said something stupid. He said, "Hey, let's build a house here, one for Moses, one for Elijah, so we can commemorate this, we can have people come here, we can have a divine visitor center, etc., etc." Whatever he was thinking, he blurted it out. Now that didn't happen. In fact, the gospel heavily implies that this is not the way to go. However, it would be disingenuous for us to pretend that we don't do this because guess what? Here I am standing in just such a house. In fact, most of us have grown up thinking of this as literally the house of God. So how do we reconcile this? We, as followers of Jesus, need a place, need a community, need some boundaries around our understanding of God, while at the same time knowing that God refuses to be contained by those understandings. If we have this dichotomy, why do we need a church? Why did we end up building a house when Jesus clearly wasn't going to stay in one? And you know what? I think there are good answers to that. And the first one is the one I just said, that we do as human beings need to have some kind of limited understanding of God that is true, but that we admit is not sufficient. In other words, it's perfectly fine to say, I understand God in a certain way, you understand God in another way. Both of those are true, neither of those is sufficient. And it's permissible to say this on a community level as well. We need to come together and learn from each other's understandings and celebrate God together and do things together to serve the world that we could not do otherwise on our own. But at the same time, we must not say that when we come together in a communal understanding, like a church, that we have it right or we have encapsulated God completely and we have contained God in this house any more than we could do that in our heads. Instead, here is what we say. Remember what Jesus did coming off this mountain. He went out into the world and healed and served and talked to other people. And though we build a house so that we can have some remembrance and understanding of these events and of the God that we serve, the purpose of that house is the same as the purpose of the disciples: to follow Jesus, not to contain Jesus. Every time you've heard a church say, we have the answers, we are the ones, or even the more subtle explanation, hey, we've got God, you need God, come to church to get God, and we will dispense God to you. We are violating the story of this Transfiguration Sunday and this scripture when we do that. Instead, here's what we have to say. This house around us, it's really cool. Come into it, you will get an idea of what's happened here, of who God is, of what Jesus has done. But the idea of what Jesus has done is not in itself the thing. The thing is gaining enough of an understanding to be able to recognize God when God is at work outside of this place, because God is everywhere, and God walked off of this mountain, and we still follow God even today. And as we come together to get a handle on what that means, so we can then go and do it elsewhere, just as Jesus did. Any church that points you inward and tries to contain you in the name of containing God really is representing neither accurately, neither you nor God. Instead, what you want is a house that is wonderful and welcoming and full of life and spirit, that also says that that life and spirit exists outside of itself. And the reason that you are invited in is not because you cannot get that stuff elsewhere, but because we all need to be able to recognize, see, and follow that stuff elsewhere in order to do what the Transfiguration did for us, which is allow us to recognize God, again, celebrate God, absolutely serve God, and do all of that through seeing God out in the world and helping our neighbors out in the world. Think about that as you go throughout your week, and think about your conception and your relationship with the church. If you think the church is the house of God and your house isn't, or the church is the house of God, but your streets and your neighborhood are devoid of God or faith, you probably didn't hear this gospel accurately. Instead, regard your church as a way to express God, to recognize God, and to open up the possibility of God in your life outside of it, and you will understand not just God better, but the reason to come together as a church to celebrate Him.